Next week marks the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Now, it's formerly known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and that happened back in August 28th, 1963. Now, that, of course, had Martin Luther King Jr., he was there, and gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. And, of course, that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to the very important Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, this weekend has seen quite a gathering of civil rights leaders. Representative John Lewis, who is the only surviving speaker from the original event. Now, he said this weekend at the event, quote, "I gave a little blood on that bridge in Selma, Alabama for the right to vote. I'm not going to stand by and let the Supreme Court take the right to vote away from us." Now, the Supreme Court had invalidated portions of the Voting Rights Act, and it was earlier this year, ruling that the measures used by the law to determine districts requiring federal scrutiny must be updated by Congress to be constitutionally valid. And, of course, we know that Congress isn't exactly in a hurry to act, especially on things like that, especially when Republicans and conservatives are not exactly keen on upholding the right for minorities, the poor, students, elderly, disabled people to be able to vote. And
right,
we've seen
of course, that works against their interest. When those people vote, they have a tendency to lose.
Yeah, Goo syndrome, Paul Ryrick, I know I keep going back to him, but he said it, the more people that vote, the less chance we have of winning. We do not want people to vote. And so this is very, very important, because this March on Washington, this could be seen as a sort of a new civil rights movement, being able to reaffirm our rights to vote, because
Absolutely.
a lot of states have restricted voting, and I want to get into that a little bit later.
Well, and they rushed into making more restrictive voting laws as soon as the Supreme Court voted down that provision in the Voting Rights Act. They just rushed to.
It's open season.
Absolutely. It was amazing how I think Texas was probably the first one to instill a draconian,
Not surprisingly, because they have a very large, growing Latino population, and they could technically become a purple state if all those people were registered and could vote. And they, Texas legislators want to make sure that they have to have that ID, and it has to be as burdensome and restrictive as possible.
It's amazing how far backwards we've gone in the last couple of years in our legislation in so many states. I never thought I'd live.
It's not surprising, because when you vote regressives into office, you're going to get regressive policy.
Well, I guess it's not surprising, but it's just amazing. When I was younger, I never thought I'd live to see the day where I was worried that we'd actually return to the days of 1950, where women don't have the rights over their own reproductive health, and black people aren't able to get to the voting booths as easily as everyone else, and poor people can't. Of course, poor people can't. Hispanics can't. Old people, college students.
No, this isn't like the 1950s. You're missing one important thing. Tax rates for the rich were at 70 to 90%.
Right. That's true. Things are worse than they were.
This is actually trying to go back to the 1890s. Representative Lewis had this to say, quote, "I've come back here again to say that those days, for the most part, are gone. But we have another fight. We must stand up and fight the good fight as we march today. For there are forces. There are people who want to take us back. We can't go back. We've come too far. We want to go forward." When you vote in regressives, you get regressive policy, and this is just exactly the kind of thing that we have to fight against, is regressive policy.
It's got to be so hard for some of those people that lived through and went through and fought for the civil rights movement. To see this happening again, and to see what they fought so hard for be lost and slipping out from between their fingers. It must
Everything
be
that they did
absolutely
is
heartbreaking.
being rolled back, is being invalidated before their eyes. All
It's
their work
absolutely
is unraveled.
heartbreaking. And I just want to remind some people, if you don't know, the provision that was voted down in the Voting Rights Act was the provision that basically requires legislators and lawmakers to prove that any laws that they make about voting or going to the voting booth, any voting restrictions have to be proven not to be
Discriminatory, you mean?
prejudicial, yeah, against any particular group. So the burden of proof was on them. Whereas now that provision is gone,
Now the
the
burden of proof is
individual
on the government. The
and
government now has to prove after the fact, after the election, that there was discrimination.
and that requires individuals to actually have to file a lawsuit and get a lawyer and all that other stuff. And of course, this is after the fact, when the votes are already lost, when the people are already disenfranchised, and there's nothing to be done, to recount the votes and have an actual fair election.
According to the Brennan Center for Justice, there have been restrictions. It goes down the list of restrictions passed just this year. And of course, you have photo ID in Arkansas. In Indiana, you had challengers to demand proof of identification for voters. Montana had a referendum to repeal Election Day registration. In Nebraska, you have a reduction in the early voting period. North Carolina, photo ID is required to vote. They've eliminated same-day registration, eliminates pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-old citizens, and reduces the early voting period. Some nice disenfranchisement there. North Dakota, you required a photo ID. Tennessee, you have a very restrictive photo ID requirement. Virginia, once again, a photo ID, and restrictions on third-party registration. Oh, no, you're not voting third-party here in Virginia. No. Republicans, Democrats, you're stuck. That's all you get to vote for.
Doing their absolute best to prevent any progress from this country.
Of course, because you know that both parties work for the banks.
There's so many of them.
Mm-hmm.
They work so fast. Since the Supreme Court made their decision. Gee, I wonder if they were waiting for the decision.
I think they were. Now, some more of these laws, I'm going to break them down a little bit more specifically. These identification laws, at least 22 states have introduced legislation either requiring voters to show photo ID at the polls or making existing photo ID laws more restrictive. Then there's proof of citizenship laws. At least 8 states have introduced legislation requiring proof of citizenship, such as a birth certificate, to register or vote. Show me your papers. Show me your papers! That's essentially what I think of.
Yeah, I think this state already had one of those provisions. I had to submit a copy of my birth certificate in order to register to vote.
And you know what? Of course, that impacts the poor and the elderly. Sometimes elderly don't even have a birth certificate if they're over a certain age. And then, of course, it costs money. It costs a lot of money to go and actually get a copy of your birth certificate.
Yes, it does. It usually costs about $20. My grandmother didn't have a birth certificate. She was about 89 when she died.
And that's how you disenfranchise the poor and the elderly. Great. And not only that, but they're making voter registration harder with these laws. And at least 7 states have introduced bills to end Election Day or same-day voter registration, limit voter registration mobilization efforts, and reduce other registration opportunities. Now, there's some poor churches that would do voting drives, souls to the polls, right? In some of these largely African-American neighborhoods, poor African-American neighborhoods, that will vote for Democrats. And, of course, if they get rid of this, reduce their registration efforts, well, you can't get those people out to the polls who are more often poor. Now, of course, I don't think the church should be involved in politics whatsoever. I don't want the church involved, but nonetheless, this does help. Getting this, souls to the polls program, it does help people. It
Yeah,
does
they
help
they do
people.
that everywhere though. They have churches around here that set up the voting booths during election time and you know, tell people to come in.
Mhm.
Actually, my voting station is at a church, ironically enough.
Indeed. So is mine. So is mine. And then finally, they reduced early voting opportunities, and that's at least 7 states have introduced bills that limit existing opportunities to vote early in person. So, and there's more. At least 2 states have introduced legislation that would further restrict the right to vote to persons with criminal convictions. That includes nonviolent drug offenses.
Of course! Oh, why didn't I see that coming? Yeah, we've got to disenfranchise those people. They don't deserve to have any say in the government anymore
Of
because they
course,
smoked a joint.
they smoked a joint, got caught, and then suddenly they're disenfranchised to vote. They're unable to own a gun, which I actually have a friend who can no longer own a weapon based on that. Which I think that's the dumbest thing. If you're a nonviolent offender, you should be able to exercise your Second Amendment right.
Right, I agree. It's ridiculous that, you know, someone, yeah, obviously violent offenders who committed a felony, no, they don't get a weapon.
Of
But
course,
nonviolent drug offenders, nonviolent offenders of all kinds, there's no logical reason why their Second Amendment rights should be stripped away.
exactly. See, we're pro Second Amendment.
Yeah.
And finally, at least 2 states have proposed legislation that would make it harder for students to register to vote. Once again, they're going after the poor, the elderly, the students, and minorities. And those are the people that they don't want voting because guess what? Most of them seem to vote for Democrats. And that is, well, that is just painfully obvious what they're doing. Anybody who can't see
Yes.
that
Well,
has
none of the
wool over their eyes.
absolutely, and none of the restrictions that you mentioned in that list have anything to do with preventing uh,
Voter
voter
fraud.
voter fraud, which is almost non-existent. You know,
Yeah,
there's
look,
actually more.
there's a higher chance of you being abducted by aliens than proving voter fraud exists. And a lot of the stories that we see where there is voter fraud, it's being perpetrated by Republicans.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. There are more shark attacks than there are cases of voter fraud each year. There are more cases of people getting struck by lightning than are cases of voter fraud each year. And, you know, people say, well, it goes undetected. Well, if it goes undetected, how the hell do you know anyway?
You're pretty much essentially saying that these people are so smart, they're so devious that they're able to fool you and vote 3 times for a
Right,
Democratic
as
candidate.
if that helps a lot, as if that would make a real significant difference to vote 2 or 3 times, you know, for one person to vote two or three. That's the most they'd be able to get away with, is that.
Oh,
And
but
most
they
cases of voter fraud that we've been experiencing have come from conservatives, like that girl that was only registering Republicans to
Republicans for
vote.
Romney. They think that these people are so devious enough to vote 2 or 3 times using Mickey Mouse and Goofy Goofy or Pluto the dog, whatever, and yet they call these same people that are being disenfranchised lazy,
Right.
stupid. They call them all these names, and then
Freeloaders.
at the same time say that they're smart enough and devious enough to defeat all of our defenses against voter fraud. Come
Right.
on. Come on, you guys are crazy.
It
You're
doesn't make
absolutely
any
crazy.
sense. You can hardly wrap your head around the mind fuckery that they try to push on people and try to get them to believe. It doesn't make any sense.
It's obvious that they're lying to the people and trying to disenfranchise them because, once again, they don't want people to vote. They don't want people to exercise their right as an American citizen to vote for their representatives because
It
in
goes
all
against their
honesty,
interests.
they don't want us to vote for our representatives because they don't represent us. And they
Right.
represent their donors. They represent the rich multinational corporations and wealthy
Yeah,
donors
they want to go.
that pay them.
Yeah, they want to go back to the day in the 19th century when only
Rich,
wealthy
wealthy
landowners
landowners
could vote.
only could vote.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where they want to bring us back to. So what we have to do is that we have to challenge this notion that voter fraud exists and challenge these laws that disenfranchise eligible voters, people who are here that have always had the right to vote. They want to take that away from you. And you know the saying, you don't know what you got till it's gone. Well, one day you're going to wake up and realize that your right to vote for your representative is gone, and then that's when you're going to miss it.
People do tend to take their rights for granted these days.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people that do. We don't get enough people voting, and mainly it's because people have caught on to the fact that our politicians don't serve us.
Things
they
are
don't
working
represent
out.
us, but they would if we voted and got the money out of politics. But that's a different issue.
I agree, and I think things would go a lot better if we actually started modeling our government a little bit after Australia, who has compulsory voting. They actually help people get out to vote because they want everyone to vote.
Right, unlike the modern conservative movement that does not want everyone to vote.